Rack pulls are underrated, not just for building mass in the posterior chain and improving your deadlift when done right, but also for getting yoked. Let's be real. Hip hinges are a game changer if you live on free weights. Without them, you're unlikely to achieve that dense 3D look that Jordan Peters always talks about, which is commonly observed among the best deadlifters. Now, you don't need to be an elite puller. 4 to 5 plates for reps is enough, but when you're strong, the upper back stretch is everything. Think about it logically. When you're hinging in the bottom position, your torso mimics a bent over row. With your arms extended out in front of you, holding hundreds of extra pounds, wouldn't the extra effort alone promote growth? Isometrics still build muscle, especially for the spinal erectors, and optimal lifters emphasize those exact deep angles, sometimes including a flexion component. So if you're dynamically moving in and out of that position, really feeling the back pulling apart, and with all this new data suggesting the length of position is most important, doesn't that mean you're getting quality work in even without bending your arms, which primarily hits the rear deltoids and lats? Isn't that also why farmer walks and cheat rows are so effective? It's not just about evening out the strength curve at the top. After all, the squeeze is least important. Last I checked, you could also emphasize protraction at the bottom and retraction at the top, which is what the upper back does. So why would that suddenly not count on hip hinges, but count on rows with far less weight? It doesn't make any sense. It must be connected, which we 100% see in the real world. Otherwise, we might as well stop emphasizing the way to stretch altogether. It's no coincidence that since reintroducing rack pulls into my program, I've been experiencing painful upper back DOMs after every workout, more than anything I've done in recent years. It's not only muscle damage, and even if disproportional, it does tell us something about the potent stimulus. And if you give your body a chance to recover, your back will grow. It's common knowledge at this point among those who truly lift heavy, not beginners and poorly designed studies where there are no weaknesses in the kinetic chain, that you're building the upper back through extreme weighted stretching. And it doesn't matter if the moment arm is small, the high loads compensate. Alec Onkiri once said that if you can deadlift 500 pounds, the indirect stimulus to your back can be comparable to rows in terms of thickness gains. And if you complement that with heavy vertical pulls like weighted pull-ups, you'll be fine. There's a lot of truth to that statement. The massive absolute load is the X factor for hypertrophy, even though deadlifts train a lot of muscles, some not as effectively or efficiently. But the upper back, not the lats, isn't the area that suffers when it comes to growth here, even when it's secondary to the glutes. So I'm fully admitting this. We know the stimulus to fatigue ratio is unfavorable, and that's the biggest downfall of deadlifts and rack pulls. But can they still be good mass builders if you're putting up respectable numbers and doing your best to manage fatigue? Absolutely. You must program them in a way that doesn't wreck you for the rest of the week. In my experience, the typical novice approach is actually best long term, doing just one top set once a week. Ramping sets of 4 to 6 or 6 to 10 with 1 to 2 reps in reserve are recommended. Stop doing singles and triples on hip hinges for hypertrophy. So if your target is 500 for 5, after warming up, I recommend 4-5 times 5, optional 455 times 5, and then 500 times 5. Going up a half plate per jump. It's 2 to 3 ramping sets, but only the last one really counts. If you want to do another set with 500 and have the recovery to do so, great. But 3 sets is generally overkill. 9 out of 10 of you won't ever need to, as it kills the rest of your workout and bleeds into the week. So with a high intensity approach, you should get your volume in through other leg motions like good mornings. This way, you won't be as beat up. Because yes, the SFR features high fatigue, but it's also high stimulus, and that happens quickly. That said, I much prefer rack pulls over deadlifts because they allow you to assume the perfect position for your body type. The idea that everyone needs to pull from the floor is powerlifting dogma and needs to be eradicated already. First, consider the size of the 45-pound plates, which determines the end range of motion. At the bottom of the lift, you're often exceeding your active hinging range. Hip flexion was already maximized before you got down there. So now, you're bending your knees for leg drive and flexing your spine more. A Romanian deadlift, RDL, is a truer expression of pure hinging strength that works within your active range of motion. You rebound after the stretch reflex is initiated, not focusing on where the plates arbitrarily are in space. They may or may not touch the floor. Your build and form will determine this. Therefore, when you go deeper than the terminal range of motion of an RDL, as seen in a conventional deadlift, you're using other muscles to alter the movement pattern to get lower. This means that while we could all technically do deficit deadlifts or pull with smaller 25-pound plates, you're not actually hinging more from the primary movers. This is what everyone misses when discussing deadlifts. The hardest part, the bottom, is out of sync with your internal leverages, made worse through not accounting for all arm lengths. All things being equal, if you have two lifters of the same height and overall body proportions, but one has a positive ape index, basically a longer wingspan compared to height, while the other has a neutral or negative ape index, then the one with the positive ape index is essentially doing a block pull, muscular-wise. They don't have to bend down as low. For them, the starting position closely aligns with their active hinging range, or might still be in it if they're truly exceptional. So if you copy their training as if you're built like them, you won't be able to tolerate the same percentages, amount of sets, or frequency. And the truth is, for most lifters, pulling from the floor exceeds their active hinging range. But what's mind-blowing is that a minor adjustment, like elevating the plates 2 to 4 inches off the floor, is all that's required to permanently fix this issue by matching our leverages to the lift. And lifters with a bencher's build might even benefit from further elevation. It's absolutely essential to consider the range of motion of an exercise versus the range of motion as it pertains to your anthropometry. The best exercises are in sync here. In general, performing below the knee rack pulls with the lowest pin height is objectively a more biomechanically sound hinging position than pulling from the floor. The key is that the bar starts below your knees, slightly above mid-shin. If you look at the total range of motion, it's similar enough to a deadlift that if you filmed yourself and cut out the floor, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That's how deep you can get. The misunderstandings about carryover, often driven by ego, comes from rack pulls above the knee, where hundreds of pounds more can be lifted. But comparing an 18 to 24 inch deadlift to a low rack pull isn't even in the same realm. Please acknowledge the difference. What I'm advocating for general development is exclusively below the knee rack pulls. Decades ago, Louis Simmons discovered that the weight should not be more than 10% heavier than your pull from the floor. If it is, then by default, it means you're no longer hinging properly, likely pulling from your kneecaps or higher. The truth is, even when you're in your active hinging range, the absence of leg drive might cause you to lift less or exactly the same amount. So if your pull from the floor is significantly weaker than your pull from the rack, it proves that your form is off. Interestingly, for many lifters, pulling 2 inches off the floor can be harder than pulling off the floor, simply because you can't use leg drive. At Westside, there was a guy who could raw deadlift 900 pounds, but his block pull was 855. Of course, the opposite can also occur. In my experience, I'm often stronger on a deficit deadlift compared to a pull from the floor because when I'm pulling from the ground, I'm completely bent forward like a pendulum rope, the worst possible leverages for deadlifts. This compromises my form so much that even introducing a slight amount of extra leg drive helps me drive off the floor. So I can usually lift about 2.5% more, assuming it's a 2-inch deficit. Applying this logic to rack pulls, it becomes clear that not all heights are created equally. However, there is a range you should stick to, and you'll need to figure that out through trial and error by pulling from multiple heights, similar to Bob Peoples' old school progressive range of motion method, but staying in the lower ranges of course. My classic advice is to pull from 2, 4, and 6 inches of elevation, with 6 inches probably not being necessary for most of you. This is easier to manage with a rack that features west side hole spacing. As you can see with mine, the Hydra rack by Bells of Steel, I can micro adjust it to find the perfect pulling position, where everything is locked in for my structure. Now let's put into perspective what a realistic 5 to 10% overload really means. If you can deadlift 495, aka 5 plates, 10% of that is 50 pounds. Add that to your max, and you're looking at 545, so exactly 5.5 plates. That's what you should hypothetically be able to lift at the most intense rack pull height, which would be about 6 inches off the floor. If you're pulling from 4 inches off the floor, you might be around 525, and 2 inches off the floor, about 510, assuming you're gaining 15 to 20 pounds per adjustment, right? But what you have to ask is, what's providing this additional load? It's improved leverages. You're actually maximizing force production of the primary movers because, as I mentioned before, when you go lower, you're actively flexing your spine more and increasing the moment arm at the knee. So let's be very clear. Your glutes and hamstrings are not contributing more at the extreme bottom of a deadlift. The hip extensors have less leverage, so you're not getting more out of less weight. You're just being limited by what shouldn't be primary. In its purest form, a below-the-knee rack pull is all posterior chain. The only reasons to pull from the floor is for leg drive specificity. more lower back, if that's somehow your goal, and to adhere to a standardized competition range of motion determined by the arbitrary 17.7-inch diameter, 45-pound plates set by Olympic weightlifters in the early 1900s as to not decapitate themselves. Crazy that we still follow that standard today, right? From a muscular standpoint, if I've got 600 pounds on the bar and the range of motion is reduced by a few inches, it's not much, but that's enough to spare my lower back having to maintain that difficult position. If you're not blessed with orangutan arms, this might be a smarter way to train than just do conventional deadlifts, bro. Any other style is cheating. And I'll stand by that statement, as I have for years. When it comes to stimulus to fatigue, because I could already hear the DLs chirping, you're going to be taxed either way. The moment you hit 5 plates on any deadlift, it becomes not optimal. So I don't want to hear the argument that, oh, you have to load up more plates, therefore the overload isn't worth it. Listen, you're already overloading your system, so stop making excuses. There's no way around this, including on RDLs, which you recommend and do, unless you're weak. So if you really didn't want to overload, you just do good mornings, which is what I did for years. So if you're going to choose a heavy hip hinge with a bar in your hands, it might as well be the one that maximally works the posterior chain while also overloading the upper back, in a form factor that's better suited for most lifters and facilitates improved lower back recovery within our active hinging range. It's a logical choice for getting yoked and building hypertrophy from already compromised hip hinges. I would use the word deadlift, but it's important to understand the difference. Now, you're not building as much specific strength for pulling off the floor, and you would need to practice that position for maximum competitive performance, but if that's not your goal, who cares? You'll still build an elite deadlift. I want to make that very clear. And if you're a hypertrophy bro, you'll be more than satisfied with the high enough carryover. So if you only do below the knee rack pulls, you can get close to your deadlift potential without ever training directly for it. The primary movers that control hip extension are strong, and you're still training in deep joint angles. I can say the same about getting my 600-pound sumo. I didn't do a single pull from the floor, just good mornings, which, when equating the torso angle, would be the equivalent of an RDL going right under the knees. My lowest rack pulls are deeper, for crying out loud. You'll also notice that I'm pulling from straps, not pins. Unless I'm at the gym, which is a compromise, the benefit of the straps is that you can use your best barbell without damaging it, and the soft landing is significantly easier on the joints. It also standardizes your form because the bar isn't rolling all over the pins. There's no horizontal deviation and zero bounce at the bottom. With metal on metal contact, there's a shaking effect, and you can even see the plates moving. You have to wait until the rattling stops before exploding back up, or some people might even exploit that rattling to give themselves a boost off the pins, similar to a deadlift bar. The way I do it with the straps resembles a block pull more closely, just without needing to pull out the slack. I'd argue that this difference alone can reduce the risk of lower back injury because you're pulling off a stiff bar that's sunken into the pins. It's very machine-like, very piston-like. You're just going up and down in a locked-in position. The bar sinks perfectly and you explode back up. No momentum, no rattling. It's actually the most stable hip hinge you could do. You'll be in the same spot every single rep with consistent timing. This form is more foolproof. Just brute force it, and your body will naturally figure out what to do. Strength is the only limiter, not your leverages or skill. So for those of you considering buying a half rack instead of a power rack, I'd advise against that if you want to do rack pulls. Nowadays, most companies offer these straps, so there's really no benefit to going back to the pins. The same logic applies to squats, by the way. The soft landing makes all the difference, and it's what actually got me back into rack pulls in the first place. Overall, they make the movement less whippy, which increases motor unit recruitment and provides more stability for hypertrophy. Another advantage of rack pulls over deadlifts is time efficiency. If you're a free weight connoisseur like myself, you might start your workout with barbell back squats. After that, you'll probably move on to a hip hinge of your choice. Here, you have a few options. The fastest is stripping off some plates and going straight into good mornings. No additional warm-up needed. This provides the best stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is what I've been doing since 2019. It's the most efficient way to get more out of less weight, while still developing your glutes, hamstrings, and lower back muscles just as well. However, you won't get the upper body gains that rack pulls offer. Rack pulls are more systemically taxing, which is both a pro and a con. But if you use low volume, that's mitigated to a large extent, as I mentioned earlier. Anyway, after squats, you can choose between a good morning, a deadlift, an RDL, or a rack pull. Out of these, as I just pointed out, the fastest option by far is the good morning, as you can go straight into your work sets without any additional setup. The second fastest option is the rack pull or RDL. The reason is simple. The plates are not on the floor, and you're already in the rack. Let's say you finish squatting. Strip it down to 135, reverse clean it onto the straps, and do 5 reps with a double overhand grip. Then, immediately hit 2 plates and do another 5 reps. Finally, load up 3 plates, strap up, and get 5 reps. Now you can start resting. The quick warm-up is done. You'll find that within 5 minutes, you're already up to peak load, and you did it all from the rack, where the plates were right there, either from your previous squat sets, or it's on the horn post in the back. You're just sliding them on with no strain. You don't need to use those 2.5-pound plates to shimmy the bar into position, which still requires effort. You don't need a deadlift jack either, which takes up space and is something most gyms don't even have. Let's be honest, and this might be the reason why you don't deadlift. One of the worst parts about deadlifting is loading up the damn plates. It takes a long time. It's annoying and actually tiring. So if you can have the bar slightly above the ground where you can fit your thumb underneath, that's enough clearance. Thumbs up to that. And again, it's straight from the J-cups to the pins. I value that because what used to be a time-consuming part of the workout is now quick. On that note, I should also point out that most people do not have a deadlift platform or access to band pegs. However, with a power rack, you can easily double up some bands using the pegs that come with it. This setup is the most feasible way to apply accommodating resistance to hip hinges. While you could use shorty bands and step on them, they don't provide the same feeling and are more unstable, like doing a sumo stomp exercise. They don't accommodate the resistance like anchored bands and can interfere with your form. Pegs is really the only effective way to do it unless you're doing block pulls with chains. But even then, when you use blocks, the chains might not fall evenly. They could end up on the other side of the blocks, or their form factor changes between repetitions. So the best way here is clipping them within the sleeves. But again, you'll need more carabiners and they could slide around. With rack pulls, there are no such obstructions. The plates are tightly off to the side, and if you want to throw off the chains at any point, you can. Plus, with block pulls, you need to stack multiple heavy blocks, and it's not easy to slide those plates on. So if you're a conjugate enjoyer, these details matter for precision and not wasting energy. The Recon Joggers have been my top choice for the past year and a half. I own every color and have worn them more than any other bottoms in my collection, from PRs to collabs. And now, Barbell Apparel has raised the bar yet again with the new 3.0 version. The leading jogger is back and better than ever. These sell out incredibly fast because they're just that good. Last round, they sold out 10 times. The new Recon Joggers feature waterproof zippers, a redesigned waistband with a premium texture, updated branding, an improved ankle opening, and added internal pocket storage. They offer the perfect blend of modern style and practicality without compromising aesthetics. They're unmatched as general workout joggers and will be my go-to moving forward, even though I'll still rotate in the originals. Grab them now, and while you're at it, check out my new Insignia tee to complete the look. Can't go wrong with black on black. So your support made this possible, and it's the same athletic fit you love, now featuring my initials in a helmet design. So check my link in the description box, and thanks again. Another consideration is that rack pulls can also be done on non-lower body days, priming your nervous system and overloading all the major back muscles. And of course, the spinal erectors contribute to that thicker look and will assist all bent over rowing motions. So after your last set of rack pulls, when you followed up with weighted pull-ups, in my experience, you'll fly up. Here's a little secret that I've never shared until now. Most of my one-arm pull-up PRs were achieved immediately after heavy rack pulls, often without a warm-up, because a fraction of that total pulling load feels lighter. It's similar to doing weighted pull-ups and then stripping down to body weight. Yes, rack pulls are a different pull, but when you have over 500 pounds on the bar, any follow-up pull feels that much easier. Potentiation is a real thing, and this is where confusion often arises. Should you place a heavy hip hinge on your back day or leg day? For most people, it's better on leg days. But if you're training each muscle twice a week, except for legs, you can easily try a density day setup, with the rack pull being your opener. For example, if you do an upper-lower push-pull hybrid split, the pull workout can feature rack pulls, while the lower day can include RDLs or good mornings. That's my favorite way to blend it. Another option is what Brooks Kubik used to recommend, the abbreviated routine, where you might just do rack pulls, lat pull downs, and curls. It's a minimalist approach that surprisingly works, ideal for a maintenance phase or if you're specializing in presses or arms. You can then add opposing leg accessories that you didn't hit in your initial leg workout or that best address your weaknesses. One more thing, when you deadlift off the floor with a non-stiff bar or deadlift bar, it's going to bend in the center, putting you in a similar pulling position to low pulls. So unless we're talking about carryover under IPF conditions with a stiff bar, the rack pull makes sense here. And if you do it with straps, it offers the best recovery out of any dead stop hip hinge. That's why in my training, you mostly see rack pulls and RDLs. Both train the same joint angles and complement each other perfectly. Just that the RDL incorporates a stretch reflex in the hamstrings and is more eccentric focus. So you can argue the recovery evens out since there's more muscle damage. But you're working the same range of motion, but it's not partial according to your joints. It's partial compared to the conventional deadlift off the floor, which I'll continue to stress is completely arbitrary. You should go as low as you can tolerate without changing your back angle or bending your knees further, unless the goal is to perform stiff-legged deadlifts, which is a different discussion entirely. You want it to be a pure hinge. And if you look at an RDL, that's the purest hinge, more so than a conventional deadlift because of the leg drive involved. So if you keep hinging as hinging, it's only going to benefit your posterior chain. Likewise, if you do rack pulls from the same positions, it's going to feed into the RDL, building the relevant joint angles for those primary movers. Plus, you'll have a more explosive pull that also overloads your upper back and traps. So if you ask me, the ultimate trio is below the knee rack pulls, RDLs, and good mornings for volume work. And if you can add accommodating resistance with bands or chains, which works perfectly in the rack, you're golden. You'll rarely tweak your back, you'll maximize the upper body weighted stretching benefits, and reduce overuse while developing strength in all the low pulling positions. Like a 2-inch below the knee rack pull with chains will have 1-to-1 carryover to 4 inches elevated but raw. So you're getting brutally strong at pure hinging in the angles that are designed to do just that. No longer do you have to be limited by your quads or lower back in the worst position. That's why I love rack pulls. They provide a shotgun stimulus to my overall yoke and posterior chain in a safer and more efficient way. Compared to pulling from the floor, rack pulls allow me to overload the muscles that matter while being gentler on my lower back. Considering that everything I do involves free weights and I'm always actually loaded and engaging my core, that's a big deal. This way, I can continue to push hard on my bent over rows, standing overhead presses, and even increase the frequency of my back and leg training if I want. Pulling from the floor really takes a lot out of you. Notice how there's talk about squat everyday programs, not deadlift everyday programs. Most lifters can't get away with pulling heavy from the floor frequently. Even doing it twice a week can be difficult. And for me, it's practically impossible with high effort. On the other hand, you can easily do 3 sets of 10 good mornings twice a week or alternate between rack pulls one day and RDLs or good mornings the next. This way, you'll feel infinitely less trash while building more muscle than if you just did one pulling session from the floor. Again, those who are built to deadlift can't relate to the average lifter. I would say 50 to 70% of average lifters would be better suited for below the knee rack pulls, low block pulls, or high handle trap bar deadlifts in the long term. And I'm not the first to notice this. Greg Nuckols made the same assertion in 2017, and he's a competitive, science-based powerlifter, which says everything. It's a fact that dogmatic influencers don't want to admit. You have control based on your active hinging range. It's no longer arbitrary for bodybuilders and general strength enthusiasts. Pure posterior chain work while also enhancing yoke development. What's not to love? The only people who still demonize rack pulls and get away with it are those who focus on extreme partials, where you're exceeding that 10% rule I mentioned earlier. And it's the most pathetic strongman argument of all. Anyone who compares above the knee rack pulls with below the knee rack pulls is a dishonest cherry picker who shouldn't be trusted. But if you're overloading by a minor amount and the range of motion is adequate, anyone with 2 functioning eyeballs can see that you're doing a proper lift. You're not going to end up in a failed compilation and no one can talk smack. It looks respectable because it is. And you can display impressive pulling performance if you ever wanted to. So stop referencing ego lifters who are completely upright and not even hinging at all. They're using all quads like a vertical leg press with upper trap stretching, which does work for that purpose, but I digress. If you want to strengthen your entire back and posterior chain, You must learn how to hinge in a way that carries over. This way accommodates everyone's build, facilitates superior recovery, and is a biomechanically smarter option overall. Especially with safety straps, you get a lot of bang for your buck. Rack pulls are not trash for hypertrophy. While they might not have the best stimulus to fatigue ratio, if you keep the volume low, it's far less of an issue. And again, whether you're pulling from the floor or rack, you're overloading regardless once you reach a certain experience level. So either you're not going to do any heavy hip hinges because the same logic applies to RDLs as you will reach a point where you're pulling 4 to 5 plates for reps, or you might prefer good mornings. But then funny enough, those same critics who bash rack pulls will have their own arguments against good mornings. If we follow their logic, we should never do hip hinges again, which pokes holes in their one-dimensional thought process. Ignore them and give rack pulls below the knee another shot. Results talk, and they'll serve you well if you keep your ego in check.